Good morning, everyone. So today we'll see about the position and extent of subclavian artery, vertebral artery, and the carotid artery. So from where it arises and where it terminates, in between the course and rotation, their tributaries. So we'll see one by one. First, subclavian artery. So introduction about this. So the subclavian artery is found just below the clavicle. That's why it is termed as subclavian artery. So these arteries are named according to the regions. So it's the primary source of supply, blood supply to the upper limb, and therefore it is termed as artery of the upper limb. And on the other hand, the subclavian artery also supplies the thoracic wall, head and neck, brain through its branches. So the origin is the right subclavian artery arises from the brachiocephalic trunk, but the left subclavian artery directly arises from the arch of aorta. So the arch of aorta gives the three main branches. One is brachiocephalic artery, and the second one is left subclavian artery, and another branch is left common carotid artery. So the right and the left subclavian artery arises from right from the brachiocephalic trunk, but the left arises directly from the arch of aorta. The subclavian artery, from the origin, it arches upwards and it goes laterally over the pleura and between the scalenus anterior muscle and scalenus medius muscle, and it covers the pleura and terminates at the outer border of first rib, where the artery then continues down as axillary artery. So the termination of subclavian artery is outer border of first rib. So the parts of subclavian artery. So subclavian artery is divided into three parts. On every side, the subclavian artery is divided by the scalenus anterior muscle. So the first part, second part, and the third part. First part arises from origin to the medial border of the scalenus anterior muscle, and the second part is just behind the scalenus anterior muscle. Third part from the lateral border of scalenus anterior to the outer border of the first rib. So you can see in this picture, so the three parts of subclavian artery. First part, in relation to the scalenus anterior muscle, just medial to the scalenus anterior muscle, is considered as first part. Behind the muscle is second part, and lateral to the muscle is third part. So the muscles, so the branches of the subclavian artery. So this is nothing but the arch of aorta gives rise to three main branch. One is brachiocephalic trunk, then left common carotid artery, and the third one is left subclavian artery. So the left subclavian artery directly from the arch of aorta, but the right subclavian artery arises from the brachiocephalic trunk. Let us see about the branches. So each part. So the branches from each part. First part, branches from the first part includes. So the first part gives rise to the three major branches: vertebral artery, internal thoracic artery, and the thyrocervical trunk. So So the vertebral artery, it runs cranially, that is upwards, through the foramen transversorium of the cervical vertebra and joins with the vertebral artery on the other side. Together it forms the basilar artery and it joins with the circle of Willis that supplies the brain. So this is the first branch from the first part of subclavian artery, and the second branch from the first part is internal thoracic artery, but this runs downwards or caudally just behind the ribs, giving off anterior intercostal branches, perforating vessels to the breast and terminating in the superior epigastric artery in the abdomen and the musculophrenic artery. And the third branch is thyrocervical trunk. Thyrocervical trunk, it is very short and it divides into inferior thyroid artery, suprascapular artery and transverse cervical artery. So this thyrocervical trunk is also known as cervico-dorsal trunk. So these three branches, the vertebral artery, internal thoracic artery and the thyrocervical trunk, all these three main branches arises from the first part, that is from the origin to the medial border of scalenus anterior muscle. Now the costocervical trunk is the only branch that arises from the second part that lies just behind the scalenus anterior. So this costocervical trunk divides into superior intercostal artery and deep cervical artery. And the third part, that is from the lateral border to the outer border of ribs, lateral border of scalenus anterior muscle to the outer border of first rib. The only branch is dorsal scapular artery. Sometimes it also arises from the second part. So this passes backwards to supply the levator scapulae muscle and the rhomboids muscle. So this is about the subclavian artery, and next we'll see about the vertebral artery. Vertebral artery, we have seen that the first part of subclavian artery gives rise to vertebral artery. So the origin of vertebral artery arises from the first part of subclavian artery. It ascends the neck by passing through the foramen transversorium of the upper six cervical vertebrae. So it enters into the skull through the foramen magnum and pierces the dura mater and arachnoid mater. It enters into the subarachnoid space. So the vertebral artery enters into the subarachnoid space through the foramen magnum, and by piercing the dura mater and arachnoid mater, it enters inside. Now both the vertebral arteries join together at the pontomedullary junction, that is the junction between the pons and the medulla, and together it forms the basilar artery. So the vertebral artery usually have a luminal diameter of about 3 to 5 millimeters, and it is divided into 4 segments. So based on the course, it is divided into 4 segments. So the first segment is the pre-transverse segment, that is from the origin to the transverse process, foramen transversorium, present in the C6 vertebra. So that is before the for a transverse process of 6th vertebra from origin. So that is considered as the first segment. That's why it is termed as pre-transverse segment. So before piercing the transverse process, the segment is considered as pre-transverse segment. Now the second segment is the transverse segment from the So the first segment is the origin to the before the transverse process segment. Now the second segment is the transverse segment, that is the part that lies from the C6 transversorium to the C2 foramen transversorium. So that pierces through the foramen transversorium. So that part that is passing through this area is termed as transverse segment. Now the third segment is the suboccipital segment, that is outside the skull, just below the occipital region above C2. So that starts from the foramen transversorium of C2 to the atlanto-occipital membrane. So this segment forms a loop that allows free movement of head and neck. So that is the third segment. And the last segment is the intracranial segment. So just above this, it enters through the foramen magnum and enters into the skull. So the part that is inside the skull is termed as intracranial segment. So it's the point where the vertebral artery pierces the atlanto-occipital membrane to form the basilar artery at the pontomedullary junction. So the intracranial part of each vertebral artery gives rise to the following main branches: meningeal branches, posterior spinal artery, anterior spinal artery, and posterior inferior cerebellar artery, medullary arteries. So the branches from vertebral arteries: meningeal branch, medullary arteries, anterior spinal artery, posterior spinal artery, and posterior inferior cerebellar artery. So the next is carotid artery. So the carotid artery, the right common carotid artery arises from the brachiocephalic artery just behind the right sternoclavicular joint. But the left common carotid artery arises from the arch of aorta, and that is located in the superior mediastinum. The common carotid artery runs upward through the neck under cover of sternocleidomastoid muscle from sternoclavicular joint to the thyroid cartilage. Termination. So this terminates at the upper border of thyroid cartilage, where it divides into external and internal carotid arteries. So through the course, it runs inside the carotid sheath. So the carotid sheath is a connective tissue sheath that includes the common carotid artery along with the internal jugular vein and the vagus nerve. So the carotid sheath is embedded, common carotid artery is embedded in a connective tissue sheath called the carotid sheath. So along with this, internal jugular vein and vagus nerve runs. So this one special feature. And the second one is carotid sinus. So carotid sinus is nothing but there is a small localized dilatation at the point of division of common carotid artery or at the beginning of the internal carotid artery. So this dilated portion contains numerous nerve endings, which is derived from the glossopharyngeal nerve. So the carotid sinus serves as a reflex receptor mechanism. So this carries the variations in the blood pressure, thereby it helps for the regulation. And the next one is carotid body. So the carotid body is a small structure that lies posterior to the point of bifurcation of the common carotid artery, and it is innervated by the glossopharyngeal and the vagus nerves. carotid artery is a chemoreceptor. Carotid body is a chemoreceptor, and these carotid bodies are responsible for the sensitivity to the excess amount of carbon dioxide as well as reduced oxygen tension in the blood. So such a stimulus reflexly produces a rise in the blood pressure as well as heart rate and an increase in the respiratory movements. So these are the special features of the common carotid artery. So from origin to tell the divisions that it is present inside the carotid sheath. So the carotid sinus and the carotid bodies are the receptor mechanisms that gets stimulated by the variation in the blood pressure as well as variation in the chemical composition of the blood, especially hypoxia and hypercapnia. So this carries the afferent to the vasomotor center as well as the respiratory centers. So the branches of the common carotid artery, the main two divisions, one is external carotid artery and the second one is internal carotid artery. So the external carotid artery is one of the terminal branches of the common carotid artery. It supplies the structures in the neck, face, scalp, tongue and the maxilla. So the origin, the external begins at the level of the upper border of thyroid cartilage, which is very close to its origin. Carotid pulsation can be felt, and termination. So the external carotid artery ends in the substance of the parotid gland just behind the neck of mandible. So the branches of the external carotid arteries: superior thyroid artery, which supplies the superior part of the thyroid gland; lingual artery supplies the tongue; facial artery supplies the tonsils, salivary glands, muscles and the skin of face; ascending pharyngeal artery that supplies the pharyngeal wall; occipital artery supplies the back of the scalp; posterior auricular artery supplies the auricle and the scalp; superficial temporal artery supplies the scalp; maxillary artery supplies the upper and lower jaw, muscles of mastication, nose, palate and meninges inside the skull. So next, internal carotid artery. So this is another branch of common carotid artery. So the internal carotid artery forms a part of the circle of Willis. The main branches arising from the internal carotid artery supplies almost part of the brain. The internal carotid artery also begins at the level of upper border of thyroid cartilage, and it supplies the brain, eye, forehead and the part of nose. The coarse internal carotid artery ascends in the neck, which is embedded in the carotid sheath along with the internal jugular vein and vagus nerve, and that passes deep to the parotid gland, which enters into the cranial cavity through carotid canal, the petrous part of temporal bone. From there it passes through the cavernous sinus and then it leaves the sphenoid bone and lies lateral to optic chiasma. Terminates by dividing into anterior and middle cerebral arteries. The branches of internal carotid artery: ophthalmic artery, posterior communicating artery, anterior cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery and choroidal artery. So these are the main branches of internal carotid artery. So next we'll see about the subclavian vein and the internal jugular vein. So subclavian vein origin, it is a continuation of axillary vein. So the veins and the arteries, veins carry the impure blood. So this distal portion comes as origin. So it arises from the continuation of axillary vein at the outer border of first rib and terminates at the medial border of scalenus anterior muscle, and there it joins with the internal jugular vein to form the brachiocephalic vein. So the course, again the subclavian veins, from the origin it arches across the pleura at a level just below the arch of the subclavian artery. So this two forms an arch, subclavian artery and subclavian vein. These two are separated from each other by the scalenus anterior muscle in between, and this is a level at above the clavicle. So this muscle divides the subclavian artery and subclavian vein just above the clavicle. So the subclavian vein relations anteriorly clavicle and subclavius muscle, but posteriorly subclavian artery with intervening scalenus anterior muscle and phrenic nerve, and below first rib and cupola of pleura. So the subclavian vein branches are external jugular vein, dorsal scapular vein, thoracic duct on the left side and right lymphatic duct on the right side. Anterior jugular vein and cephalic vein, only it arises, sometimes it arises from the subclavian vein. So the applied anatomy here, a subclavian vein catheterization by to approach, it is either superior approach or supraclavicular approach or infraclavicular approach. And the second one is subclavian vein. So the subclavian vein thrombosis, clinically it presents as edema of the upper limb, especially after exercise. So either it can be primary or secondary. The primary thrombosis occurs only due to excessive and unaccustomed use of arm at the shoulder joint. The secondary thrombosis occurs as a complication of an indwelling venous catheter. So this is about the subclavian vein origin, termination and its branches. And next we will see the internal jugular vein, which is very important. The internal jugular vein is the largest vein present in the neck, and that drains blood from the brain and most tissues of the head and neck. So this is very important. It is a pad. Internal jugular vein is a pad vessel on either side of the neck, and it extends from the base of the skull to the sternal end of clavicle. So throughout its course, it lies inside the carotid sheath along with the carotid artery and vagus nerve. So the internal jugular vein receives 8 tributaries along its course. So its function is to drain the venous blood from majority of the skull, brain and superficial structures present in the head and neck. So the special features: internal jugular vein is vertically applied to the lateral side of the internal and common carotid arteries. It's enclosed with them and the vagus nerve in the facial sheath called a carotid sheath. So you can see this, it's a large vein that receives blood from the brain, face and neck. It starts as a continuation of sigmoid sinus and it leaves the skull through the jugular foramen. So the jugular foramen is located on either side of the large foramen at the base of the skull, that is foramen magnum. So through the jugular foramen, from the sigmoid sinus, the internal jugular vein comes out and it descends down through the neck inside the carotid sheath along with the vagus nerve and carotid arteries. So it ends by joining the subclavian vein just behind the medial end of clavicle, and together it forms the brachiocephalic vein. So the subclavian vein joins with the internal jugular vein. Together forms the brachiocephalic vein. So here you can see the sigmoid sinus at the base of the skull. So the largest one that surrounds the vertex upper portion is the superior sagittal sinus, and just below there is a small diameter venous structure called the inferior sagittal sinus. So the internal jugular vein course relation, it begins as the direct continuation of the sigmoid sinus. So the sigmoid sinus is located at the base of the skull, just below the foramen, jugular foramen. So this descends vertically downwards, drained by the sternal end of clavicle by joining the subclavian vein, and together it forms the brachiocephalic vein. Usually the right internal jugular vein is largest when compared to with left, because it drains the blood from the larger superior sagittal sinus, but the left one, that is left internal jugular vein, drains the blood from the smaller inferior sagittal sinus. And there is a special feature called superior and inferior bulb, which is located at the course. Near the superior end there is a small dilatation at the internal jugular vein, and as well as there is a small dilatation at the inferior portion called superior bulb and inferior bulb. So the branches of internal jugular vein: inferior petrosal sinus, pharyngeal veins, facial vein, lingual vein, superior thyroid vein and middle thyroid vein. So these are the major branches arises from the internal jugular vein. And one more special feature, so this can be marked on the surface. So the surface mark is by a vertical line that extends from the midpoint, that is between the tip of the mastoid process and the angle of mandible. You can draw an imaginary line and take a midpoint from there to the sternoclavicular joint. So this line shows the surface anatomy of internal jugular vein. So the clinical correlation: internal jugular vein acts as a guide for surgeons during removal of deep cervical lymph nodes. So that's all about the position, extent and the branches of subclavian artery, vertebral artery, carotid artery with its branches, and the veins, subclavian vein and internal jugular vein. So that's all about the today's class. Thank you.